All right, we have with us today Donna Macomber from the Legal Justice Project Coordinator, and Curtis Reed, the President of the CRJ Consulting Group and the Executive Director of the Vermont Partnership for Diversity. And we'll be talking about the Vermont Vision for Multicultural Future, which uses a radically different model for uniting people for their annual conference. And today we'll talk about how that model continues to impact the future of Vermont. So starting us off, Curtis, do you want to give us a little information about the origin story and how the conference came to be?
Sure. I might also note that we have two other colleagues that will be joining us shortly, Dottie Morse and Mary Gannon. So I'm taking up airspace for them while they load.
Oh, and I'll also encourage people, if you'd like, at any point, if you would prefer, if it's okay to use the Q&A box rather than the chat box, it's up to you, but if at all possible, that would be great. Take us away, Curtis.
Right, so the conference, the origin of the conference actually dates back to 2010. It's actually May 2010, Vermont Partnership convened a conference called Making Vermont Work for Everyone. And it was a conference that had about 100 leaders of color from around the state. And it was the first time we had such a gathering in the state's history. And one of the outcomes of that conference was a desire from leaders of color to have a similar experience that was not crisis-driven with their white colleagues, titled folks from institutions in government and the private sector, simply to have a conversation about our lived experience and how we can collectively forge a future together that's multicultural in its underpinnings. So that's 2010. It took us 2 years to sort of organize ourselves to create the first conference, which was in 2012. It was held at the Putney School, and we had 60 participants that were, about 2/3 of the participants were Vermonters of color, and a third were white Vermonters. And it was, folks with similar titles and similar positions of power within their organizations that we brought together. And it was really important for us to have people from different, representatives from different sectors. Up until this point, conversations around race, conversations around most anything were built around the people who were in your silo. So if you're all medical professionals, you get together. If you're all law enforcement, you get together with other law enforcement folks. If you're all social workers, if you're all folks in the racial or social justice area, you got together. So our idea was to pluck or to curate a conference where we had a wide variety of representation: government, public sector, private sector, the interfaith community, the education from pre-K through higher education. So it was an opportunity for people who were working in the same direction to have an opportunity to sort of cross-pollinate and to find some synergy in that work.
Okay. Dr. Dottie Morris is here, Associate Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Equity at Keene State College. Hi, Dottie.
Hi, good afternoon. Sorry, I was a little late, but I'm happy to be here.
No problem. And Mary is here, a consultant, trainer, and strategist for racial and social equity and strategies for growing diverse organizations and communities. We only started a moment ago, and we were just talking about the origin story of the conference and some elements that make it different. And Curtis was giving us a little background on that. So Curtis, you sort of spoke to this, and maybe others will chime in on one element that makes the conference vastly different is the premise of being invited. We mentioned that people from different areas, stakeholders from different fields are invited. How do we decide who exactly will be invited? Who determines, or how do you decide who that will be?
Well, there are sort of two areas that we look at. One is, do they have budgetary oversight within their organizations? And do they have policy oversight within their organizations? It's really important that the top decision makers in the organization attend, because one of the magical things about the conference is that we don't know what the outcomes will be. And I'll give you an example of one outcome that was total surprise. So a couple of years back, Sarah Laundeville from the Vermont Center for Independent Living met Meg Smith, who was the commissioner of tourism and marketing. Sarah said to Megan, hey, you've got this African-American trail that's run out of the Department of Tourism. Do you know that people with disabilities have money, and we like to go places, and we like to explore different areas of the country? Can you, or would you, consider the idea of creating some sort of trail or some sort of initiative that would bring or attract persons with disabilities from all over the country to come to Vermont? Megan took that idea. She went back to her office. She didn't have to discuss this with anyone else. And she did an inventory of all of our state facilities that were fully accessible. And she packaged that as Inclusive Vermont. And if you go to vermontvacations.com/inclusive, you'll see, how Vermont is pushing itself into the disability community. That was just the sort of the random chance occurrence of two people who met at the conference who saw value in what each was doing, but they didn't have to go through the bureaucracy of, well, let me take this idea back to the office, let me run it up the flagpole. But it was the executive director of a statewide organization speaking to the director of tourism and marketing. So that's sort of one example of this kind of synergy, but also why it's really important to have people whose portfolio speaks to policy or speaks to budgetary issues to be at the conference.
Thank you. And what would any of us say about any pushback about how maybe anyone who's interested should be able to attend? What do we say in like the support of curating even the invitation? Anyone have any opinion on that?
Well, I think, and we have had pushback. We have turned people away. And or at least my response to them has been, you don't have budgetary oversight and you don't have policy oversight in your organization. We're looking to move the needle in the most expeditious way. And if you're sort of a mid-ranked or lower-ranked employee of the organization, taking it to the top and getting action is going to take that much longer.
You mentioned that relationship between the differently abled population and tourism, and that being able to sort of grow that relationship and improve something for Vermont in that moment. Does anyone want to share any other moments at the conference that have improved Vermont overall as we consider the future of Vermont and its relationship to the conference?
Donna, are you going to jump in?
Go ahead, Mary.
I'm not sure. I want to make sure I understand your question, Alana. But I think my first response is that when I think about, are you asking about impact? Okay, great. And I think it's a little bit connected to what Curtis was just talking about in terms of the curation of this, or how we make decisions about, who attends. But I think the original idea was to see if we could bring in stakeholders from a range of different contexts, from different institutions, from different parts of the state. And what that allowed us to do was to build on a network that I think was really already there in many ways. And I was relatively new to the state myself, and I don't live in the state. But I think that there's a lot of cross-fertilization from people from these different places of influence or stakeholder positions that is really important when we think about how we sustain this kind of work around equity and justice. And to have people who are coming from these different parts of the state, who are embedded in different places, but also have different spheres of influence. And we think that where it can be most powerful is when people who are in positions of leadership and have some power are able to figure out ways of embedding this framework or this lens of equity and social justice into the places where they are coming from. So I feel like it's built on that. I would say now, I will speak for myself, having missed a year, it will be interesting when we are able to come back and kind of pull back in some folks to see what has been happening, because this last year, in my observation and experience, has been quite powerful in terms of also this multi-generational effort that's happening, bringing in people from across generations. So, and certainly young people and youth. So I'm excited about that.
And I would just add to that, I agree with everything you said, Mary, that part of, I think, the power of this conference and convening in this way, it's sort of unapologetic. We're unapologetic that there's an agenda to move the needle. And yet the nature of the conversation across those different sectors, I'm sure there are people who, for the first time in that setting, are having conversations about white supremacy culture, and maybe getting some takeaways from those conversations that they hadn't anticipated when they were invited to sit with a group of 60 or 70 people. And I think that's part of the power for me, is not just how these folks use their spheres of influence, but how then they walk away from those 2 days with a different understanding of what the nature of the work is, that it's not something you do from 9 to 4 when you're on the job. It's really a way of life to show up and be accountable and notice racism and think about racial equity and have those conversations with people in your life and in your family and around the table at your holidays. So I think there are many side effects and many impacts that are not really anticipated from the folks that attend.
And I think the other thing that I found a couple things. One is it's not the usual suspects, so to speak, that attend, and it may even be counterintuitive, for some people to say, well, why is this person here? But what it does is it allows us to see people in a different context, in a different way, and then to see how we could work together. The second thing, for me, it's more about reinforcing what I believe needs to happen, that I don't get that reinforcement in other places. So when you go there, other people are able to reinforce some of the things that you think need to happen, because in your day-to-day interactions and work, you may not be getting that reinforcement. So I always equate it to a revival meeting, so to speak. I grew up, in the church, and we would have these amazing revival meetings that basically you could say you could give a witness and people would examine that and kind of encourage you to go on and to move further. And not only that, but to meet with you to help you strategize how some things could be done. And the third thing is this whole idea of, because you don't have the usual suspects there, you start to make connections between entities that wouldn't just be a natural way of looking at it. So if we think about like the social determinants of health, some of those things that we think about related to the social determinants of health, we don't think about them day to day as being connected for good health. In the same way, if we're looking for a healthy, anti-racist community, that there are certain things we have to pull together that we wouldn't just automatically think connected. And so part of what would happen at the conference is it would broaden your way of thinking about how we need to approach being anti-racist or pro-inclusion kinds of things.
Yeah, Donna mentioned, I want to dovetail just a little bit of what Donna's talked about, just in terms of the size of the conference. It's curated, but we have a maximum of 60 people because it is highly interactive. We don't set the agenda until everyone is in the room, and which is another reason why curation is so important, because we want to make sure that we get a wide variety of views in the room to have this sort of shared experience.
One element Donna sort of touched on already was the idea that there are people of different ethnicities having a very open dialogue about race, which doesn't happen that often. And I know that there was also the introduction of the white affinity group, which is something that is typically not done. Can we speak to what that experience was like, having an entire group, many people who have not ever met, having these like sort of in-depth conversations about race in a space, in a setting that they typically would not, and with people with whom they normally would not be discussing race?
Well, I want to relate that question to the question in the Q&A related to policing. So as I look at the document that the person put in there, one thing that I see is that there could potentially be some limitations to only focusing on policing without focusing on the larger cultural context of why we have. So at the conference, those type of discussions are easy to have. That we're not just going to say, bad police, good police, but we're going to talk about the context of what is the creation of having individuals who are part of law enforcement, and what kinds of things went into us developing and giving permission as a culture to have people police the way that they do. Because I think in some ways that has been given, and we haven't done a good analysis of the larger culture to understand why policing is done the way that it is. It's not to take the blame off of people who act outside of the agreement of to serve and protect. That's not what I'm saying, but I think that sometimes it's so narrow that we just want to focus on police and policing without looking at the larger cultural context. At the conference, you are looking at that because you're connecting poor policing or whatever with education. You could see how our educational system, our criminal justice system, our police, all of those things are connected. And so if we're going to work on policing and not education, we're not going to really have a major impact on policing. If we're not looking at, the climate of everyday people engaging with other people by calling the police in the first place when they're trying to go into their own homes and understanding the mentality about that, we can't just work on policing. We have to work on having some of those conversations that Donna said, is what's informing our idea of who's dangerous. And what do we need to do to have a lot of surveillance of people who we perceive as more dangerous? So the psychology of that has to be, and I think at the conference you get into not just the surface issues, but we're really trying to dive into the roots of the situation. So I just wanted to relate it to that question around, our thoughts about the the document that they put in there. And I just wanted to use that kind of as a case study person to just talk about how it is different at the Vermont Vision Conference, because we'll talk about all of those interlocking pieces.
Yeah. I want to piggyback on that. That's so important, Dottie, because I think part of the challenge, or what I find is one of the obstacles in engaging in this kind of work, whether, you know, just as somebody who calls herself an organizer and activist, but also professionally, is that it does get siloed. You know, it does get siloed into, we're only going to talk about this. We're going to have a conference on community building and policing, and without seeing the interconnections of that. So I think that's a really important point, Dottie. And the other thing I would say is, you know, I think it's important for folks who are listening to understand that, you know, this is really hard work that we're talking about. We're talking about culture change and organizational change and trying to change people's way of seeing the world, which is a lot of what happens in the affinity group work. And I know, Alana, you asked that question, and I'm happy to go back to it. We got a little sidetracked. However, what I want to say is I feel like the conference builds on itself. And I think, Dottie, you were getting a little bit of that as well. Like, we are building relationships. We're scaffolding it each year. So, you know, the fact is, and I appreciate the question from this participant in the document. I mean, it concerns me a little bit when we get into sort of like good cop, bad cop, and create that kind of divisiveness. What we're really wanting to do is welcome people into a conversation that many people have not had before, particularly in law enforcement, in many institutions. And then to think about how we create a space at Vermont Vision where we work on what does it mean to be in community together. We build guidelines. We have a framework that we talk with each other about how we will have difficult conversations, and we call them that. So, and we name discomfort, and we feel like that's really important. And then people will come back. So in the following year, when somebody comes back, they're ready to really engage because they know that it's a place where they can bring their full selves. And even if they make mistakes or they have an oops moment, there's a way that we can help them see that. So I do think the education piece of what we do is so important. And then the other piece I'll say quickly is there's a lot of conversation that happens not in the sessions, but when people are on the dance floor or having a meal or having a snack together. And that's where some of this, I think, building some literacy around how we talk about this also happens as well.
Yeah. There's also this phenomenon that these relationships continue after the conference ends. And I'm going to take the example of law enforcement, where Vermont State Police over time has brought Vermonters of color that have been at the conference into the organization, into the Fair and Impartial Policing Commission, where they've met folks like Eton, they've met other folks that have pushed their thinking during the conference, that they left the conference wanting to continue that push, wanting to continue to push the envelope, as it were.
And one other facet I think is really important to just bring in is, so often, especially in white learning environments, I feel like people, sign up for things or invited into things and then become these receptacles, these passive receptacles of information. But right out of the gate, from the very way that introductions are done, that, you can't really be in that space and not bring your humanity fully. And that means bringing the things you feel confident about. It means bringing your humility. It means making mistakes publicly. And I think another thing that happens that's been really powerful over the years is watching people in positions of leadership own their mistakes in front of their colleagues and, sort of really driving home that, having difficult conversations is something that every adult should have learned to do way before now. And having difficult conversations about racial equity and racism and white supremacy really puts many, many people on their raw edge. And I think to be expected to show up and bring what you have and stay present, and to have the focus of the conference be on the capacities and the questions that people are coming into the room with, makes it really different than most learning environments.
So it's been mentioned a couple times that a lot of the conversations are pretty critical, and we know that having these kind of conversations can have a physical and an emotional toll on everyone, all parties involved, but especially people of color. How does that factor into the planning, and how is that a consideration to protect people's emotional state during these conversations for the time of the conference?
Okay, so all the folks of color that move into the space of the conference can hold their own and go toe to toe with anyone. Not that it's confrontational, but what it does is, and when white folks encounter a relatively large group of folks of color that are well-educated, that have all kinds of life experience, that know who they are and are centered in their Blackness or brownness, it changes the dynamic, because it's the sort of paradigm of trying to be paternalistic or trying to be the overlord of folks of color doesn't work at the conference. And so it's a safe space for all, both Black, white, brown, and other. And it's not a space that's designed to protect white fragility. It's not a space where folks of color present as victims. I mean, we at least for me personally, I present as a person, as a survivor of racial injustice, which is different from being the victim all the time as a narrative. And you know, the folks of color that show up at this conference, I believe, share that sense of being a survivor of racial injustice, but then understanding that, you know, we need to develop the sort of consciousness, both Black and white, to move the state forward.
I think, you know, to some degree, you know, this whole idea of racial battle fatigue, and sorry about that, a motorcycle drove by, racial battle fatigue, and you know, what Lillian Comstis calls traumatic racial stress. Part of what, you know, that does exist, some research that she's done on that. But I think the affinity group work really does help with some of the things that you're asking us about. So when we go into those affinity groups, you know, we're able to kind of talk about experiences that we may not be able to process with other people. And so even if you know, something happened earlier that day, we could talk about it, or something that happened earlier that week or earlier that year, we're able to process that. So I think that the way that the conference is organized, allowing for those moments for people to connect, where you don't have to do a lot of explaining. You could basically start the sentence and other people are nodding their head, kind of reinforcing it without you having to finish, you know? And that in itself is a form of release by having someone validate your reality. And so I think that that's one way that, going to your question, that people, you know, mental and psychological well-beings can be accounted for as people of color.
Mm-hmm. And I would ask, if I was allowed a question, Mary and Donna, what does that look like in the white affinity group?
Yes.
Well, you all know, so that's why you're well, I'll start, Donna, and please, fill in some of the blanks. And, I think, again, so as somebody who's an educator by training and also was introduced to this model in graduate school, it was something that I went through a lot of in my graduate school program, and it comes out of a lot of different fields of education and so there's a lot of ways that using the idea of affinity groups and caucus groups comes out of a lot of different fields of theory and in education and psychology. So I say that because it's important, I think, always to situate the work that we're doing in a field of knowledge, in a field that is interdisciplinary, that combines, hundreds of years of study and contributions. And I've been feeling the need to say that more, particularly over here in New Hampshire, because there's a way that even in my earliest days of teaching, and maybe some of you have experienced this was considered soft academics. It wasn't considered a field that was, when it was called sort of, in the early days of diversity, it was seen as something that was soft because people didn't understand that it was actually embedded in very important theories and knowledge bases. And so I say that as a way when we talk about the affinity group work, it's interesting because, again, oftentimes my experience with white folks is we have to explain all of that and sort of justify why this is a useful tool or approach to how we teach about anti-racism or any issue of social justice, because affinity groups can be used around any particular issue of identity. Because there is resistance to it. And oftentimes, so specifically at the conference, my experience has been that we have had in the past, one particular incident where we did have somebody who was white identified, who was not, who was unclear about why they could not stay in the group where folks of color had identified were gathering. And so we had to work through that. So there is this piece around thinking about our identity in places where when we have privilege, we don't have to think about these kinds of issues. And we have the privilege of stepping away from it. And the white affinity group the idea is asking people to really come together and wrestle with some questions about what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to you? What was your early stories about that? What was the narrative that you were told, or what was your experience? And begin to unpack that and have some exploration. Again, I have lots of different, as I'm sure some of you do as well, in different contexts where that work can be incredibly difficult. I feel like, again, at the conference, people are entering with a curiosity and they want to be there even if they're uncomfortable. But what it does is it really allows us to have these, as Dottie said, like just to have some conversations that are essential to dismantling the structures. And of course, I'll say this last piece, and then I want Donna to add. One of the things I do always remember is that when we would get into our room, into the space at the conference, oftentimes we were like a room or two or three down from the folks of color, and they're having a great old time, right? Because they're coming together and they're feeling affirmed, and us white folks are in the other space, feeling a little uncomfortable, trying to wrestle with our privilege, trying to figure out how we talk about it. So I like to say that because there's always a very there's a bit of a disparity in the tone. Yeah.
So well said, Mary. And I guess what I would add to that, not being a formal educator, my lens, 25 years into domestic and sexual violence work is being really cognizant of the difference between being in danger and feeling uncomfortable. And I think a lot of white people come to affinity groups, experiencing some level of danger. This is dangerous for me to sit here. It's also the place where I have seen and felt on numbers of times the little seedlings of potentials for white people to connect differently. And it's painful to see the separation in that room, to see people and hear people who have so little understanding of their come from place, both their own heritage and where they stand in terms of privilege. So it always is a mixture of it's painful to bear witness to that. It's also the place where there's the beginning of hope, and to see white people beginning to really talk about privilege, to own their own terror of making mistakes, which is a lot of what comes out in white affinity groups. As we're listening to the uproarious laughter down the hall and feeling some envy, it causes us to really connect with the places of disconnect. And we have to place that in the broader context of racism and white supremacy. And so, yeah, it's loaded. It's loaded, and I think it's necessary.
Curtis, did you have anything to add for that?
Only to affirm what Dottie said in terms of the dynamics within the room of in many ways it's a space of healing, a space of reaffirmation, a space of gaining clarity because of the wisdom that's in the room. So
shifting gears a little, we know that the long arm of COVID touched every single thing everywhere, and it did lead to the decision not to have the conference. Can we speak a little bit about why it was not held remotely, and sort of how we've gone about filling a bit of a void in the absence of having the conference these 2 years?
The conference is really designed for human contact, to be able to see the whole person. Right now, I'm looking at 5 people, or 4 of the people in a 2-inch box, and that's antithetical to the conference and how it was designed. It doesn't mean that the work of the conference has stopped. The Rutland NAACP was birthed at one of the conferences. The year after that, the Windham County NAACP came out of the succeeding conference, and they're doing incredible work. So we see that as an extension of the dynamic that happened at the conference. There's, I think there's also the work that we're doing in partnership with the Vermont Council on Rural Development is also another extension of the conference, albeit the Vermont Council on Rural Development has a different format. I believe that we've been able to infuse some of the ideas of the conference in the 9 propositions as they were presented for the conference. So the work continues. State police, they're continuing their work. The work at Agency of Transportation continues. Representatives from Burlington and Brattleboro, continue to work by the participants of the conference. So we just need to be in a safe space in terms of our own physical health, which is why there was no conference last year, and there won't be one this coming year, but we're going to come back in 2022.
This is sort of a two-part question. I'm wondering how the conference has changed from its inception to now. And I'm also interested in how you see it changing, or maybe even how we might like it to change, maybe in this last year of racial reckoning, with so many more people aware of some things that we've been aware of for years, how that might impact how the conference is held, or any other, I mean, COVID, all the other things that have happened in these last couple of years. So how has it changed from the inception to the most recent conference, and how might it change, or how might you like to see it change in the future? Okay.
The original conference design was borrowed from a fellow by the name of Adrian Seeger. He's the guru of unconferences. His work was really focused on people who lived in the same silo. And what we brought to that model was working with people across silos. Each year it's a little bit different. The folks that organize it, the organizing committee will take stock of what's happening in the real world, what's happening in the world that we'd like to see happen, and how can we use the conference to move us closer to that particular vision. So we don't know what the underlying pieces of the 2022 conference will be. But there's some pieces that won't change. It'll still be curated. We still won't set the agenda until everyone gets in the room. We'll have affinity groups. There's some components that are standard. How we open the conference won't necessarily change, but there might be an input of data or information that we want people's attention to be attracted to. So we have no talking heads in our conference.
Alana, I would add to that, as far as thinking ahead, and I think one of our prompts is also thinking about, in light of this last year, what this means for the movement and the work for those of us, many folks on this call, many folks here that I'm looking at, my colleagues, who have been doing this for a lifetime, almost a lifetime. So, as far as what the inputs will be for the conference, I guess I'm hopeful that there would be almost a richer context to draw from, because there is some really powerful stuff happening in the state that's coming from all different corners. And I would love to be able to, and those folks did that without a Vermont Vision Conference, right? Those folks did that because they stood up or they've been doing it, like many of us have been doing it. So I think it'll be interesting to see if those inputs to the conference will kind of bring a richer fabric, so to speak, of what we talk about. But, I have to say at the same time, and I think this is really important to say this for folks who are also listening, we still have some very significant challenges. I mean, we have Black women of color who are running for elected office in the state who are having to leave these positions because of racial violence. We have families of color who are needing to consider whether they should move or not because of the kinds of racial harassment happening in the communities where they're living. Mm-hmm. We have kids, I don't need to lay out all of the examples of this. So yes, I just think the work continues, and what my hope is, and what I think we do a really important job of at the conference, is we call people to the table and we keep them there, and we call on them again and we keep them accountable. And that feels incredibly important if we're going to sustain this. So that's why it is a bit of a different event, because there is ways we do accountability. and we come in and check with people and we ask people, you know, did you follow through with what your promise was at the end of the conference? And so that feels, you know, really important. But I will say that I think post-pandemic, we will be seeing a lot of significant challenges that have been with us and will continue with us. And we're going to need some real creative solutions.
I guess I want to add to that, and it's something, Dottie, that you brought up in the beginning, is just how essential it is to look at the context, really all of the complexities, right? And of how racism continues to exist in all of the systems and structures. And I feel like this past year has really given a lot of people in Vermont a deep desire to reimagine those systems. I see it a lot in my work with survivors of violence, just the criminal justice system, the Department of Corrections, a lot of focus on law enforcement, a lot of focus on, all the cops in schools. And so I feel like we're at a place in this state where people are really having those conversations outside of their work hours. And I'm curious to see how much of that comes into our conference in 2022, because I think if we don't get on that right now, it's going to be more of the same for the next decade. I think we have to really strike while the iron is hot and begin to dismantle the systems that really perpetuate racism daily, and to help people see the bones of how that happens. I feel like there's a lot of willingness, and Mary, your word, curiosity, to understand how it all works, how privilege and power work to keep racism inherent in all of the systems, all the criminalization that happens. And so I think that's going to shift the conversation some in our conference in 2022.
I also think, I've lived in a couple other areas of the country, and, where there were larger percentages of people of color. And in those settings, a lot of people of color spoke for themselves. What I've observed in my short 20 plus years of living in New England, oftentimes people from the dominant group feel like they have to speak on our behalf. What this last year has shown for me is the number of people of color who are feeling more emboldened to speak for themselves in such a way and take on agency in such a way that it makes a lot of liberal white folks uncomfortable. And so I think that particular kind of thing of navigating will be part of the complexities of navigating what goes on at a conference such as the Vermont Vision, given the new consciousness of a lot of, especially younger people of color, is this idea of taking that agency. And so what does it mean where white liberals have grown so accustomed to speaking on behalf of people of color? Now people of color are basically saying, no, I want to speak for myself. That's the tension that I'm seeing now, is that particular loss of identity for white liberals when it comes to addressing racial difficulties. I don't think that it's impossible to navigate what that means. It just means that we'll have to start having that in our consciousness as we sit together as a multiracial group, of being strategic and intentional about how we proceed and do the work. And that in itself can lead to a lot of D'Angelo stuff around white fragility, about, well, I tried to help y'all. Y'all don't know my help now. I'm gone. I'm out of here. No, how do you sit in this with us and say, yes, you feel more emboldened now. And what does that mean for my role as a person representing a dominant status? So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Mm-hmm.
That is interesting. So in terms of allies, or as Curtis aptly refers to them, our co-conspirators, how do we see that sort of playing out in the conference in general? Because Dottie made a brilliant point about how some shifts have happened in terms of reclaiming or initial claiming of voice. How do we think that will impact the conference or just the state of Vermont?
I think it will have a much broader impact on the state of Vermont. And this might be my own, I might be imagining this in my head, but the folks of color that show up at our conferences have claimed their agency already. And the description that Dottie talked about, much broader, is that yes, our demographics are changing. We have more folks of color coming in. We've got more young folks of color that are part of our communities, and they just ain't taking it anymore. And so that is what is that creative tension between the progressive liberals and, you know, the broader community of color, which is growing really rapidly, is an element that we're conscious of, and I think that will play itself out in future conferences.
Shifting a little, I know that we've all attended tons of conferences, meetings, and you use the term unconference. What do we think we can offer as suggestions, advice, guidance for people who are sort of trapped in that more traditional model, but do want to get closer to doing the more meaningful work and having a new model? What suggestions, what takeaways from the conference or otherwise can we offer to those other institutions and organizations that are grappling with the same issues, but are stuck in more traditional structures?
You know, one of my favorite quotes came from a well digger sitting on top of a dune in the middle of the Tenere of Niger. And it was, you can't dig a new well by digging an old well deeper. What the conference does is it provides the opportunity to break ground on a new well. I think the old well, where people are set in their ways, because they've been doing this in this form and fashion, and so that it's difficult for them to see what other options there are. I think the conference plays a really important role in unleashing that creativity, unleashing the cross-fertilization that is so necessary to move Vermont forward.
I would also add to that that folks who are considering a different model, first of all, I think they need to do their research, which, you know, we certainly did back in the early day. Mm-hmm. And so they need to do their research. And I think it's really important for organizations or groups or in profit, private, whatever sector that's considering this, is to get some clarity about their goals. So what is it that they actually really want to achieve? Because sometimes, I don't want to say this. Because again, it's important that the values or the sort of the principles that are driving a conference or a reason to have a conference are actually going to match what it is that the organization or the entity that's running the conference, how it will actually show up in the outcomes. You know, like how are those two things parallel? I mean, I know I've been to so many conferences, and I can think about conferences where I was a presenter and I was really excited about what I was presenting, and I thought it was really important work. And then, you know, 3 people came and everybody else went shopping. So I've had that happen. And so, you know, I think it's just really important to get some real clarity about if you have the resources to do something and to set some goals for yourself, and just to have that clarity can be really helpful. Because if you just want to bring people together and go shopping, you don't even have to have a conference to do that. You can find a different way to do it. I just think we're at a particular pivotal moment that to use resources wisely, to have real clarity about what it is that we're doing, and to make sure that you have the thought people, the thought leaders who can help, especially around this body of work, that can be there to support the effort.
We have about 3 minutes before we wrap. I do have one question about the just Vermont Partnership initiatives while we're here, since the vision comes from the partnership. But before we do so, does anyone want to share any last minute highlights or anything that really stands out, like the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the conference, or anything else you might want to share with us before we move into initiatives and then question and answer? No. Okay. Curtis?
Great. So we have a number of initiatives. The first of which is the Vermont African American Heritage Trail, which is designed to bring folks or to attract visitors into the state, particularly visitors of color and families of color, to learn about Vermont's African American history. We have I Am a Vermonter, IamAvermonter.org, which is a website that HR professionals and or persons of color outside of the state will use to get a reading on what it's like to be a person of color in the state of Vermont. We have we do consulting work under the banner of Vermont Partnership, where we work with entities, public and private entities. And I'm getting old. I know we have 4. But we have the, we have the trail. We have I'm a Vermonter. We have, oh, I'm embarrassing myself. Well,
I'm sorry, I can't help you out either.
we may just have 3.
We're all at a loss, so we'll always revisit the website of the trail itself.
That's why we finished one.
Right.
Okay, thank
It's been a long day.
No worries. Well, we are out of time. Thank you guys all so much for participating. Thank you, Gemma, for sharing that for us in the chat, the Vermont Vision for Multicultural Future, if people want to visit the site, and also the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Justice to also get more information. And I think Gemma's actually about to list them all in there for us.
Yes.
Thank you, Gemma. You
Right.
saved the day.
The Vermont Vision Conference was the 4th. The topic of Vermont.
Go figure. Okay.
Right.
Wonderful. So if you have any other questions, we are not able to see the entirety of the rest of the chat. So if you'd like to put them in the Q&A box, or unless any of the panelists have any additional thoughts, I know Mary and Dottie have sort of chimed in already on the response to the Multicultural Vermont and its relationship to policing. But if anyone else has any questions, you can feel free to insert them there now. And if not, we will be wrapping up.
Great.
All right, great. Thank you very much to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who is here today. Please visit the site, and we look forward to seeing hopefully some of us at the conference next year.
Yay.
Having an unconference.
Great.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Alana,
Bye.
thank
Bye.
you. Bye.